As parents, we are running kids to soccer, to volleyball, to cheerleading, to cross country. The list goes on. And the kids are getting younger and younger, with sports starting at age 3 in some cases. Is this safe?
We do have a lot of guidelines around how to make sure that kids aren't sort of overdoing the organized sports.
On today's Mom Squad, we talk about the safe ways to start kids in sports early, when to recognize they're overdoing it, and how to prevent injuries on the field. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on Mom Squad, the show where we talk all things parenting. I'm Maureen Kyle. And it's an exciting time of year now that the kids are back into the swing of school. That means after-school sports. In the U.S., though, about 30 million children participate in some sort of organized sports. And according to Stanford Medicine, 3.5 million injuries happen every year. No parent wants their child to be injured. So today, we're talking about the best way to prevent injury and what to do if your child does sustain one. But first, let's take a look at what can happen.
I felt something off in my elbow. Every time I threw, it would hurt, and then it just stung for a couple days and stuff. So then we went and got it checked out, and it turns out my growth plate came off my elbow.
Last year, Caden Vogelpaul was just one of the millions of injuries that happened across the country. In fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics says 775,000 kids visit the emergency room every year with complaints of sports-related injuries. Caden's was caused by overuse after a condensed season due to COVID restrictions.
So a lot of injuries that we see in all ages is from that change in intensity, from sitting doing nothing to doing too much. And the best way to prevent that is to make sure you're active.
Dr. Laura Goldberg with University Hospitals Cleveland says kids need to exercise 50 to 60 minutes a day. And exercise means movement, so anything that gets them using their cardiovascular and muscular systems. The CDC says practice makes perfect and prevents injury, as long as it's done the right way. So athletes and coaches need to pay attention to proper technique. And if your child complains about an ache, take it seriously.
Make sure that, if your kid tells you that their arm is hurting, don't just kind of blow it off. Kind of make sure you're going and getting it checked out. Unfortunately, we waited a little bit.
No one will tell you that they don't care if they get injured or not. It's very much an accident. That being said, injuries can be prevented. I sat down with Dr. Weiss Kelly, also a sports medicine specialist from University Hospitals, to talk about what to do to keep our kids healthy.
So one of the reasons I wanted to sit down and talk to you is because we are in the middle of fall sports season, and I just hear more and more parents being concerned about injuries, especially with little kids doing a lot more club sports than they used to, and then just, maybe they weren't as active over the pandemic. Are you seeing more sports injuries this time of year, and then especially with what's been happening lately?
So this time of year is always a crazy time of year for sports medicine doctors. I don't think we're any busier this year than we have been in past years, because it's always incredibly busy. So particularly when you have football and soccer and field hockey and volleyball and cross country, all that start at the same time, it's the busiest time of year for us. Overall, I think we're seeing slightly more overuse kinds of injuries than we maybe have in the past. And overuse injuries have always been the bulk of the injuries that we see in sports medicine. So anywhere, depending on the sport kids are participating in, typically 40 to 60% of the injuries we see are overuse injuries. And that would include things like bone stress injuries, such as stress fractures, tendonitis or tendinopathy, as well as kind of chronic muscle strains. So issues like that have always been the bulk of what we see in sports medicine. And this time of year is no different. And some of the things that sort of contribute to overuse injuries are training error. And that's probably the biggest issue we see. And for kids, they're not really in charge of their training. And so they can't say, Coach, I'm not having a great day. Maybe I shouldn't run 6 miles today. Or, they don't have a lot of input. And sometimes if they do try to add input, they feel like they're going to get in trouble and they don't feel like they can stand up for themselves. So training error is a big part of it. And like you said, when someone is, perhaps playing with their club team over the summer and they're practicing, 2 or 3 days a week. They're getting 4 to 5 hours of exercise a week, which is great. I mean, that's a reasonable amount of exercise. We'd like kids to get about an hour a day. But when you go from doing 5 to 7 hours a week to practice starting, and suddenly you're doing 2 hours a day, 6 days a week, or even for some sports, 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening, 6 or 7 days a week, you have now doubled or tripled the amount that you're exercising. And so that significantly increases your risk for overuse kinds of injuries. And it's particularly important for, running and endurance kinds of sports. Like, soccer, we may not think of like that way, but soccer is a lot of running. And so we do see a lot of injuries related to training error and not gradually increasing the amount that you are exercising over, 4 to 6 weeks period of time. And it can be difficult for families to sort of recognize that that's happened, because for the first few weeks, everybody feels fine. You have soreness after practice, soreness the next day, but that injury doesn't set in until 4 to 8 weeks after the abrupt increase in the amount of exercise that you're doing. So it takes a while for that tendon or the bone to break down to the point where you have significant pain that limits your ability to participate. And so people often don't tie that change in exercise volume or exercise intensity to the injury, because they say, oh, I've been fine for 6 to 8 weeks and now suddenly I have terrible pain. We're like, yes, but it's the sudden increase over time that leads to the final breakdown of the tissue, whether it's muscle or tendon or bone.
And I can imagine older kids are probably better at recognizing, oh, my shoulder doesn't feel quite right, or my knee kind of feels funny. But I want to talk about the little kids, because I have a couple parents in the newsroom. I'm a parent myself. We're also helping out coaching. And we are even joking about how sometimes the really little ones will say, oh, my ankle hurts, because they want to get out of something. But then it's like, well, how do you know when a kid is actually complaining about a real hurt ankle or a sore something, rather than just they don't want to do it?
So I think there are a few things to think about in that situation. So one, when they continue to complain of the same area of pain over a consistent period of time. So if they're saying, my left foot or ankle hurts for 2 weeks straight, they're probably right. It does. It is probably the left ankle that hurts. And very commonly in young kids, there is an overuse injury in the foot that we call Sever's disease, which is an inflammation of the growth plate in the heel. That's very common in young kids. And they typically will say, my foot or my ankle hurts, and they'll complain about it. The other thing to watch for is, do they look like they're moving normally while they're playing their sport? So if they're limping while they're playing, or if they kind of seem okay during practice, but then they're limping to the car when you're not asking if they're hurt, then probably they are really complaining about something that's bothering them, as opposed to wanting to get out of practice. The other question is if your 10-year-old's trying to get out of practice, is there a reason why? Are they not enjoying their sport anymore? Are the kids on the team maybe not enjoying being around them, and so they don't have any friends on the team anymore and it's not fun? Or is the coach just, not a good match for the kid? Do they need to be on a different team? So even if they're not injured, if there are significant constant complaints, I think it's something for parents to look into, whether it's more of a psychological, social issue, or an actual injury to a muscle or tendon or bone unit.
That makes sense. And I want to talk about those things like growth plates and development, because as parents are signing their kids up, I mean, some kids are 5 or 6 years old and they're in a club sport. And we've all asked ourselves, is this too young? Because when I was a kid, we didn't have sports available until 6th grade. And so we were a little bit further along in development. Is it safe for kids to be starting that young? And how much is okay? How much is too much?
So it is safe for kids to play organized sports. And we definitely have become a busier society. And I think a lot of people, whether it is actual true in the numbers or not, a lot of parents are less comfortable letting their kids kind of run around the neighborhood. They don't feel it's as safe. And whether that's true or just a perception because we know about more of the bad things that happen because, we know what happens in Idaho, in Ohio now, and maybe we didn't in the 50s and 60s. So kids aren't allowed as much free play, unsupervised as with adults as before, sometimes because families are busier and sometimes because of perception that it's not safe. So we do think it's safe for kids to participate in organized activities. We do have a lot of guidelines around how to make sure that kids aren't sort of overdoing the organized sports. So one of the things that the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends is that for every hour of organized play, kids have at least double the amount of unsupervised play. And just getting your kid outside helps with that. So just physically moving them to an outdoor space increases the chances that they'll be active. So the same thing works at school. So if recess is held outside as opposed to in the classroom, they're much more likely to walk around and be active. And there's always going to be one kid who would much rather prefer to read a book than to walk around and play kickball or whatever. But that's okay. We do want kids to get a lot of unsupervised, just play with your friends and be creative kind of activity. Another guideline to use is you shouldn't have more organized hours of sports than you are years old. So if you're 5 years old, it shouldn't be more than 5 hours per week. But that might even be, quite a bit more than we think is reasonable. And most 5-year-olds, fortunately, are having 1 or 2 days of practice a week and, 1 or 2 days of games a week. And so hopefully it's fun. And I think one of the most important things that people can recognize is, and some people say, well, my kid does this or my kid wants that. And as long as the kid is the one driving the bus. So if you have, a kid who's 7 who sports is their thing and that's what they love and they want to do sports all day, every day, that child's much less likely to burn out than a kid who enjoys sports. It's fine, but maybe they didn't have any intention of wanting to be an elite athlete. They just want to kind of be on a team for the social and the fun and getting the exercise and the enjoyment. If that kid's parents are then signing them up for an extra 5 hours of private lessons that they don't really want, that they don't enjoy, that child's much more likely to burn out and then potentially be at risk for not exercising later in life, which is what we as pediatricians want sports to be, is an introduction to exercise that's fun. It's supposed to be fun and it's supposed to make you want to exercise for the rest of your life and be healthy forever. And it is nice for kids to be on a team because there is that social aspect that makes it more fun.
Now, earlier you talked about continual use, like within a season, that maybe at first there's no injury, but then later you might start to see those injuries pop up. When it comes to sports over the years and older kids, teens, preteens, are you seeing any injuries that are a lot of wear and tear on their bodies because they've been playing a certain sport for years and years since they were 5 years old?
Absolutely. And we call that sports specialization. And so we pediatricians, the American Academy of Pediatrics, we really discourage sports specialization early on. And so we don't want a 10-year-old saying, well, I'm a soccer player and that's it. And sports specialization in and of itself, so not unrelated to the time spent playing a sport and anything else, sports specialization does increase a kid's risk for an overuse injury. And so if you're playing baseball or soccer or basketball or any sport year round to the exclusion of other sports, that does increase your risk for overuse injury. We like to see kids taking a break from, even if they've identified a primary sport, because sometimes kids, my kids, they play sports. They're not gifted athletes, but they love it. And each of my kids might identify a sport that's their sort of primary sport, but playing other sports helps them with coordination and it helps make a big difference for their primary sport. And, the kids who are the best athletes are kind of great at everything. I've worked with, when in fellowship and when I've worked with kind of Division I athletes, I've had guys say, I just got my 3rd concussion in football, so I'm just going to go ahead and be a professional baseball player instead. And you're like, okay, great. So those kids who are really going to have the opportunity to go on to play professional sports are not hurt by playing a multitude of sports. They're much more likely to continue to enjoy their primary sport. And they're likely to be better at it and less likely to get injured. And so I think a lot of parents, unfortunately, get the idea that specializing in a sport is going to make a kid better at that sport and make them more likely to get a college scholarship or play professionally. And that really, again, shouldn't be the goal of sports. The goal of sports should be to have kids be active and healthy and learn how to interact with team members and be a leader when needed, be a follower when it's more appropriate. So those, the goals of sports sort of need to be reframed for some people.
You brought up concussions, which I think was pretty much top of the list for the past several years of parents and coaches' concern over injuries. But what are some of the other injuries that you see coming into the ER and coming into your offices more often?
So the acute injuries, we see a lot of course, ankle sprains is a very common acute injury that we see. We see a fair number of acute knee injuries. And, so ACL injuries people talk about a lot. And they are more common in female athletes than male athletes. And depending on the study that you look at, anywhere from 2 to 8 times more common in female athletes than males. And a lot of research has been done in that area. And what we see is that women tend to be less hamstring dominant. And we tend to land from jumps with our knees less bent and more kind of, knock-kneed pointed to the middle. And so several groups have come up with different jump training programs that can teach all athletes, not just female athletes, to jump, land, and pivot with the knee in a better position. And the statistics are great. Doing these programs, you can decrease ACL risk by about 75% in non-contact kinds of injuries. Unfortunately, the contact injuries where your foot is planted and a big guy runs into you, that's very difficult to prevent. If you're going to play a contact sport, there's always that risk that when you get hit or slide tackled, that you're going to sustain an acute injury. And short of rule changes, those injuries are not really preventable. But there have been over time rule changes that have prevented injuries. So in the 70s, after doctors recognized that cervical spine injuries in football were typically related to tackling with your head first, spear tackling was outlawed in the NFL, and it significantly reduced the number of cervical spine injuries. And that all trickled down to high school football as well. And so we do see a lot fewer cervical spine injuries now with some of those rule changes. And the same thing in hockey and soccer, when we didn't let kids head the ball at a younger age. They were less likely to get a concussion. And not generally because heading the ball itself causes a concussion, but when 2 kids go up for a ball together and hit heads, then you're more likely to get a concussion, or you fall down and hit your head on the ground. So there have been rule changes over time that have decreased the risk for acute injuries and concussions.
What about stretching and any other training that maybe kids can do at home or off the field or outside of practice? Will those measures help prevent injury, and what other things can be done?
So, the data on stretching is a little bit mixed. Certainly for sports like gymnastics, dance, skating, stretching is very important. And as kids grow, when they lose some flexibility, they are more likely in those sports in particular to get muscle injuries. And sometimes there's a low back stress fracture that we think is related to hamstring and hip flexor flexibility. And it is more common in those athletes like gymnasts and dancers and skaters who bend their back backwards a lot. That can increase your risk for stress fracture in the low back. So in that sense, particularly in those kinds of sports, stretching is very important. In football and soccer, there is some evidence that if your hamstring or your quad is more flexible, you might be less likely to get a muscle strain in that particular muscle group. But there's not a lot of evidence to say that having better hamstring or quad flexibility decreases your risk for a knee injury. But this jump training, one of the programs is super easy to do. And it's something that I do just for fitness. And because particularly in women, we lose bone density more easily than men do. It's something that, teenage athletes and preteen athletes can do to optimize their bone density. And it's very simple. It's just jumping back and forth across a cone or a line on the ground if kids are younger, for 20 repetitions in multiple directions and then on a single foot. And so that is something that's easily done at home. But also lots of coaches have incorporated it into their warm-up, doing that as a warm-up instead of they sort of standing around in a circle and not really stretching, mostly chatting. because it not only decreases your risk for injury, it makes you faster and it makes you jump higher. And so athletes are much more likely to adopt sort of a injury prevention regimen that they think makes them a better athlete than one that they are like, well, stretching's not going to make me run any faster or jump any higher or make me a better goalie or defender. So they're less likely to do that. And they've even done ankle studies in the highest level of athletes, so national and Olympic level athletes in multiple countries, where they've demonstrated very clearly that working on ankle strength and working on balance will decrease an athlete's risk for injury. And these very high level athletes have said, I see your data and I recognize that doing these exercises makes me less likely to get injured. But these are kind of boring, and I don't think they're making me a better athlete. I'm probably not going to keep doing these exercises after I finish with this study. And so it can be difficult to get athletes to do extra stuff on the side, particularly when it's not very fun for them and they don't think it's going to improve their performance in sport, even if they know objectively that it's decreasing the risk for injury.
What do you think, before I let you go, what do you think is the most important thing an athlete and a parent can do once a kid comes home and says, I don't know, I kind of feel like I hurt myself or this is feeling a little sore? What are those first steps that they should take to really make sure that the injury doesn't go any further?
So I think it's always okay as a parent to say, let's see how you feel in the morning. That's fine. But if a child persistently complains of the same pain in the same joint or same muscle tendon area for 10 days to 2 weeks straight, bring them in. A lot of athletes are afraid to come see us or afraid to go see the athletic trainer at their high school because they think we're going to hold them out. And actually, our job as sports medicine doctors is to keep kids in the game as long as it's safe. So we can let you play when you're a little bit sore, but we can also be working on the sort of deficits, whether it's a muscle strength issue or a balance issue or a flexibility issue that led to the problem while you're continuing to play. And sometimes we might decrease the number of days that you're practicing, or we might say, rather than conditioning with the team as running, we're going to have you condition on the bike instead or in the pool. So we can alter your workout a bit so that you're able to recover while you're continuing to participate in your sport. Whereas it's much harder to get kids better when they come in saying, well, I've had knee pain for 6 months. And you're like, well, now you've altered the way that your muscle patterns are activating. And it's a lot harder to get your kids, back to sport while still playing. And sometimes those kids may end up needing a complete rest. So don't be afraid to see your sports medicine doctor or your athletic trainer at your high school, because we can often intervene early on and really help you continue to play while working on the things that you need to do in order to not get injured again.
Dr. Weiss Kelly says another important key to physical health is proper nutrition, making sure your kids are getting enough calories for their activity level. She says if your child is in calorie deficit, that increases the risk for bone injury. And as with all of us, proper sleep is also key. So make sure your kids are getting enough rest. That's it for us on this week's Mom Squad. Thanks for taking the time to join us. We'll see you right back here next week.